Okay, so we're going to start talking about Django. So Django is a web framework, and so these kinds of frameworks, it's basically just a whole bunch of tools that people develop. Usually, they develop for their own internal purposes. So something like Bootstrap, which is made by, I can't remember, Facebook or Twitter, but these are originally internal tools. So you're just on a team that's doing front end development, and so you start doing the same kinds of things over and over again. You have the same patterns, and so you start reusing code and maybe even create like a little repository, and eventually that grows and kind of becomes standardized. So the same thing happened with Django. I'm sure people start out just like, I want to make a web framework, just kind of starting from nothing and then make one. I don't know of any examples. I'm sure people do that, but I think most of the time it's just something that happens organically, where you start doing things and then you start noticing patterns, and then those kind of patterns get solidified, and gradually something more and more definite starts to emerge. And then with a project like Django, this is an open source project, so it's a big deal. Lots of companies use Django, so it's one of those kind of hybrid projects where there's some institutional support for it, even though it's an open source project. So Django is it's a big animal, and we're not going to get into all of the nooks and crannies, but it's, once you get past this initial phase where things are going to probably be fairly confusing, there is a pattern for making an app in Django. Let me share my screen. So Django has three basic components or parts. There's the template, what are called views, or the view, and then the model. So the template is basically what gets it's essentially the HTML. So it's what the client is going to see at the end of this. The view is kind of the central node that's going to interact with everything and handle all of the logic of the application. And we'll see more of that in a second. And then the model is the abstraction that you're going to use to interact with the database. So at let's say the lowest level, you have the model, which is interacting with the database. You have the view, which is kind of functioning as an intermediary and also doing some of the heavy processing. And then the template, which is the final product that gets presented to the client. And we can look, so this is a common design pattern in web applications. There are different acronyms, but it's basically the same thing. So these three components. Here's another somewhat more detailed representation. So if we look, here's the browser. It makes a request to an endpoint. There's this urls.py. We'll see all of these files in a minute. So, but this is like the router. So that the request comes in, just like when you were making the server, you have get, and you have the HTTP header. You parse out the route, so /time or whatever you're doing. So there's a file in the Django project that will handle that. It will basically grab the route and then direct the request to the appropriate view. And a view is going to be a function or a class, just something that is going to say, oh, you want to go to /time? Well, let me get the current time, and let me check if you're authorized to see /time, and let me go to the database to get any other information that I need. And so in the views, all that processing will happen, And then the views can talk to the model, which is the kind of, you can think of it as basically the database. It's an abstraction on top of the database. So it can interact with the database through the model. The views can also, once it gets all the information that it needs, it talks to this template. It will generate a template and then send that template back to the browser. So this, this arrow going from views back to browser could, in a way, it's going from template to views back to browser. Okay, so that's just the basic structure of a Django application. You have this, the very front, the presentation layer. You have this core view, what are called views. The naming is a little bit confusing. So views is not necessarily what you see, right? You would think that, so there are some issues with the terminology, but if you think of views in a Django sense, it's the core kind of logic that's happening. And then the model is the backend. All right, so that's kind of the general overview of the architecture of Django. Now, once you actually start creating a Django project, so there's some technical terms here. So Django, when you create a Django project, this is like, Amazon.com is my Django project. So I create the Amazon.com web application. Within a project can have multiple components, and these components are called apps. So again, the terminology may be a little bit confusing, but you have a project, and then within the project, you only have one project, then you have lots of apps in the project. And these apps are usually handle kind of specific subsystems. Like, for example, you have a billing app. You could, if this were Amazon, you have an orders app, a photos app, a music app. So you can have an authentication app. So you can have all these different apps in your project, and that's how Django, an actual Django project is structured. So I'm talking about all this, and it's all very abstract because we haven't seen it yet. But this is just, there's kind of no way around it. So we'll just it'll make more sense once you actually do it. I think we can skip this. Yeah, so I think that's probably good for now. So the Django documentation is very, very good, and there's a lot of it. So I wouldn't necessarily try to just read through it all, because that will take quite a while. It might not be the most useful. But they have kind of a few entry points, a few ways to consume the documentation. There are some tutorials. You can just look straight at the documentation. They have topic guides that are kind of divided. So here again, we see the three basic components or layers of Django. We have the model, which is the database, the view, which is like the core logic, and then the template, which is the presentation. So we're going to be focusing on the model for this week, basically. So we're not going to be immediately jumping into building full web apps. We're just going to start with the model. So, it's kind of like going back to SQL week, basically. So we did SQL, then we did some HTML, HTTP stuff, and now we're going to double back and do SQL again. So backend stuff, but we're going to use Django's ORM. And the ORM is Object Relational Mapper. So we're not going to be writing select star from students where student.id equals whatever, right? So we're not writing actual SQL queries. We're not, writing, create table statements or anything like that. We're going to use Django, and Django is going to take your code, which is going to be object-oriented Python code, and it's going to turn that into SQL. And we'll see how that works. So here is, for example, a file called models.py. We'll see more of this again. But here's a student, so a class. You create a class called student, and this would be like creating a table called student. So a class in your model is like a table. And here are the columns. So you have these attributes, name, email, whatever. These would be like columns in your database. Okay, are there any questions just at that level, just a general overview of Django?
Does Django automatically create the ID, the primary key?
Yes, yeah, by default it does. I don't know off the top of my head how you, I'm sure that you can override that. I don't know off the top of my head how you would do that, but I think you would need a special case in order to do that. But yeah, so you don't have to explicitly say ID equals whatever, like, you know, serial primary key. Django will take care of that for you automatically. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and run through, we'll create a Django project, and then we'll create an app, and then we'll do a little bit of database stuff. So it's the README for today. So first thing I'll do is I'm going to install Django, which means I'm going to use a virtual environment. Okay, so Python -m. Let me zoom in. Is this big enough? Let's see. So create a virtual environment and then activate it. And now I'm going to install Django. So pip install Django. Okay, so now Django is installed. And Django, because it's a web development framework, has, you know, there's a specific way of doing it, right? So there are a lot of basic patterns that Django is kind of built for you to follow. And part of that, you know, maybe an explicit part of that is the file structure that it creates. So just like when you do npm init, it will create, you know, a file for you, or you do git init, it creates a bunch of files for you. There's something similar. So the command is called Django-admin. So once you install Django, you have access to this command line, Django admin start project. And then you give it a name. So in this case, what are we doing? School. And you can see that Django created this folder here called school. Let me zoom in one more time. So school, and within school, there's another folder called school, which might be a little confusing. So school has this manage.py, which you don't need to really look at or read, but we'll be invoking it. It's kind of the command line tool for Django. And then school, so this is our kind of our project level stuff. Any project level stuff is going to be stored here. So the main thing that we're going to care about is the settings.py. And this has a whole bunch of stuff here, a lot of which you don't really need to worry about at all. But there are a couple things that we'll be tweaking on a regular basis. Okay, so that's the settings, and then urls.py. So this is the main routing entry point. So this is going to handle all of the routing. So this is this urls.py. So a request comes in, it's going to first go to urls.py, and then depending, you can add routes here, and it will redirect you elsewhere. These other ones, you don't need to worry about ASGI. This is server stuff. So you don't need to worry about that stuff right now. Okay. So this is the basic structure that gets created when you run start project. So Django admin start project. This is the project, and then we can also create, well, we'll also create an app, but we'll follow this README, and we'll create a database first. So let me also point out quickly that we'll talk more about what these other things are later. But the database here, the default is SQLite 3, which we've seen the last couple of days, right? So it's this basically a file, it's like a file database. So, you know, that kind of database definitely has its uses, and this is fine for, you know, the stuff we're doing in class, but when you actually go to deploy your app on a server like Heroku or something like that, then you're not going to want to use SQLite 3, you'll use Postgres. So we'll end up changing this setting. So we'll create a database called school, and then we'll change these settings. So create DB school. So this is a Postgres database that we're creating now. And then here, I'm going to say it's not SQLite 3, it'll be PostgreSQL. And the name is just going to be school. Okay. So we've changed these settings, and now we're going to install. For those of you with the M1, you know, good luck. This is the moment of truth. So we'll see if this works. But so pip install scihop g2. This is a dependency that you need if you want to use PostgreSQL. All right. Okay. So we've taken care of our database configuration here, and we have our app. So I'm sorry, we have our project. We have our project, which is school. It creates all of this default stuff. And then we have our database configured. So the next thing we need to do is create an app. So a project can have lots and lots of apps. Typically, we're just going to have one or two as we're kind of learning. So you can invoke this manage.py. So Python manage.py, and then start app. Python manage.py, start app, and then, oops. Okay, so you have to make sure that you're in the correct directory. So I don't have access. I'm invoking manage.py, but I'm, you know, it's not available. So I need to cd into school. And here I can run manage.py, start app. So you see this folder got added. So this is my project level, this school. And then in here, I have my app attendance. Student. And then I have basically all of my settings, everything I need for the project level in this school folder, this other school subfolder. So attendance is my new app, and it looks very similar to what's here, but it's a little bit different. So I get some default stuff. One, there's a views, right? So this will, when we start doing this, this will handle all of the basic logic of our application. Tests, obvious. Models, here's where you're going to create your tables. Apps you don't need to worry about, admin you don't need to worry about right now. And migrations. So Django uses an ORM, so this object relational mapper. So you're going to write a model here, and it'll be as a class, and then Django is going to take that model and transform it. First, it's going to transform it into this intermediate code. So it's going to create a Python script based on your model, and then you're going to have to run that script basically, and then it will actually create the tables in the database. So it's a multi-step process, but you don't really need to worry too much about it. You just need to do it. Okay. So we have this app here, but Django by default isn't going to know about our app. So we need to tell it explicitly, hey, here are all the apps that our project is using. And we do that in settings. We go to installed apps, and this is already populated with a whole bunch of stuff. So even though it looks like we only have one app, this attendance app in our project, there are actually a whole bunch of apps that come by default. So there's an admin app, an authentication app, a sessions app. So there's a whole bunch of apps, and you can add more, right? So we're going to add the app that we just created so that our project knows about it. So this is fairly simple. We just call it attendance. And now our project knows about this app. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to create a model, and then we're going to play around with it. So we'll create this model, paste this in here. We'll go to our app, and then models. And here we're creating a class called student, which is going to become a table called student, basically. And what's happening here?
Inheritance.
Yeah. So we're importing. So Django has this stuff. We can take a look at it. It's like 1,000. It's like 1,000-line class, but this is, this is a monster. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. So this class, so when we create this, our student class, we have access to all of the Django stuff that we need. So it makes the implementation that we actually write pretty simple. So all we need to do in the class, mostly what we need to do in the class is create the columns. So here we'll have a name column and an email column. And here is the type of data. So character field, text field, there's email fields, there's all kinds of fields. And again, you can look in the documentation for all that. And then we're going to pass it here any kinds of other information we need, like max length. You can do, blank if it's nullable, if it can be null. There's just all kinds of things. So that gets passed in here. Okay, so we have an app and we have a model. So we have this here in code, but we need to go through this. We need to go through a couple steps in order to get this Python class into an actual SQL table. So we're going to have to run a couple things. One is this make migrations command. So the flow that you're going to get into is you're going to create a model or change a model. Then you're going to run make migrations. Then you're going to run migrate. So change your models, run make migrations, then run migrate. So we're going to run make migrations. So Python so before we do that, we can look here at the migrations folder, which is basically empty except for this init.py. So we run make migrations. Okay. And we can see that we have this file got created, 0001 underscore initial.py. So what happened is we took, or Django took this very abstract representation of a table that we want in our database, and it kind of turned it into this script. So it's a little bit lower level. So you don't really need to know any about this, but so Jen, you asked about the ID field. So you can see that this is getting created. So based on our model, whatever internal processing Django is doing, it's creating this and it's giving it an ID field automatically. Okay, but even this, we still don't have anything in our database. So our database hasn't been changed yet. So once we have this intermediate script or intermediate, representation, we need to actually run migrate to put it inside the database. So now the first time you do this, there's going to be a whole lot of stuff happening because of all of the default stuff that Django has. So most of this is just built-in Django stuff. So Django is creating a lot of databases for its own apps, for the default apps, like the authentication app and so on. So you can actually go in and check that out. So PSQL. So there are a lot of databases now that are a lot of tables in our database associated with this app, even though we've only explicitly created this one. And just a note, so we called our database student, right? But it's actually called attendance student. So Django has a default naming convention, so it's the name of the app underscore the name of the table. Okay. Any questions about that so far? All right. So so Django has been around for a while. and it's, you know, it's used by a lot of different people. So there are a lot of extensions and add-ons and helpers and so on that people develop. So there's an ecosystem around Django. One thing that we can use that's kind of generally helpful in development is something called Django extensions. You know, purely optional. We can pip install. And the main thing this is going to help us with now is that we're going to go into a REPL, and we want to be able to play around with our models, but we don't want to have to import everything. So we don't want to go into a REPL and have to import, you know, everything that's in our app before we can start playing around. So it'll handle that. So we have to add this now. So you would know that by reading the documentation here for Django extensions, but we need to add this to our installed apps. So we'll go to our project settings and we'll add this Django extensions. And I'm not going to install IPython, but so we can run Python manage.py shell plus, and that will shell plus will give us access to the Django extensions stuff. So we can go ahead and do that. And you can see we got all of these imports. So we didn't have to, that's just boilerplate, we don't have to worry about. So we're in a Python interpreter, basically using our Django application. So we have our models here. How do we do anything with that? So we could go directly into our database and write queries, but we are going to need to be able to use Python to interact with the database in our application, right? So there's a whole way of doing that that Django has. So if we want to get all of the students that we have in our database, we do student, which is the class name dot objects. And objects, you don't need to worry about it, but objects is something called a manager. So objects is basically going to handle all of these kind of like querying and stuff like that. So student.objects.all. And we execute that. Of course, we don't have anything actually saved in our database, but we're going to get something called a query set, which you can basically think of as a list. So if we want to get everything, this is like select star from whatever, we're going to get back everything. In this case, it'll be a query set. So we can create some entries here. We can create a student or a row in the student table. We can do student, and then we'll pass it in basically like keyword arguments. So name equals Bob, and then email and we can run this. And if I try to query the database again now, I'm going to get still an empty query set. So just like we saw, depending on implementation, sometimes you have to commit, right? So you can do some stuff, but if you don't commit it, it doesn't do anything. So this works in a similar kind of way. We're basically creating that that object, but to actually save it in the database, we have to run s dot. So our object s dot save. So once we run that, it should be saved to our database. And we can get all of the objects. And we have one entry now. Another thing that you're going to want to do almost every time when you create a table is you're going to want to override the string representation. So def str. So notice we just have object student object 1, which is not so helpful. So we'll do self.name. So I'm going to exit out of here. We'll go back in and let's do student.objects.all. And you can see that I get something that's a little easier to read. Okay. So I'm gonna do something real quick. I'm gonna use another third-party module to get some dummy data. So to create a bunch of entries here, to create a bunch of students. And then let's see. Yeah, and then we could run some queries. So we do exit. I'm just going to delete this real quick. I'm going to change this to okay, and I'm going to run make migration. So Python manage.py make migrations. Okay, that's going to create this file right here. I'm going to do Python manage.py migrate. That will actually create the database. So I'm recreating it right now. And I'm going to use this. I'm just going to follow the documentation. So I'm going to install pip install Django seed. This is just something I'm doing for demonstration purposes. All right. And I'm going to add this to the installed apps. So Django seed. So we go into my project configuration here. I'm going to add Django seed. And then I can actually run this with Python manage.py, pass in this argument seed, and then the name of the app, which in our case will be attendance, and then basically how many examples I want. So we can create any number of students that we want. So Python manage.py seed attendance. What was that one? Dash number. We'll create 100 students. Okay. So now we have 100 fake students. So I'm going to go into the database now. So I'm going to run Python manage.py shell plus. So now I can run this query. So student.objects.all. I can get, so, there's some configuration we could do. This is not really a student name. So this is just some dummy text. We can talk from here about some queries. Okay.
Chad,
Yeah.
for that application, did you already have all the fields that were required in it? Like, how did it know that it only needed to fill out those 2 fields that you have?
I don't know how Django C works under the hood, but we can actually see. So I can do.
Like, if I added any model whatsoever, would it work? Or
Yeah, it should. I mean, depending on whether or not there are foreign keys and stuff like that, the order will matter.
okay.
But this is not like, this is just something I'm using for demonstration purposes to generate some
Okay.
dummy data. There's also other things you can use called fixtures. If you're trying to set up some dummy data initially to run, to kind of pre-populate for testing purposes or whatever. So this is maybe a useful tool to use in the context of running tests. But yeah, there's documentation here, and there's other configuration you can use. I'm just doing the simplest thing. So we'll talk about this in a second, but you can see that there's an ID. The name is not really a name, and then the email is a fake email. So there's a whole bunch of entries there. All right, so we can do things with using the ORM that we can do with SQL. So we can write. So we can get everything, like select star from whatever. We can get everything. We can get one value. So student.objects.all returns something called a query set. So certain methods are going to return query sets, as in potentially more than one result. There's also, you can use something called get, which is just going to give you a single value. So we can do that student.objects.get, and in get we're going to pass in some kind of limiter of some sort. So we can do ID, for example, ID equals 5. And this is going to give us the student whose ID is 5. If we pass in something, an ID that doesn't exist, so if there's no results, or if there's more than one result or no results, so 500, which doesn't exist, we get an error. So a does not exist error. So that's just something to be aware of. So get returns only one, but one and only one. So if you get 0 or more than 1, then you're going to have an error.
Chad, how would you
Yeah.
join 2 tables with those queries?
Yeah, so there are ways of doing that. I'm just doing a simple example with one table, but the documentation. So we'll actually be doing that. I'm not sure if there are join queries in the exercise today, but yeah, the model layer. So here is the query sets. So if you look for the model layer in the documentation, query sets, you can see they have sections on saving foreign. We're not really talking about that, but retrieving objects, filters. So this goes over everything that I'm kind of talking about. Retrieving a single object with get, and field lookups. We'll talk about that in a second as well. Lookups that span relationships. There are a couple ways of doing this, but the documentation is fairly thorough. One sec. So there are some examples of making a query with a many-to-many relationship. So again, the documentation is very thorough, and there's plenty. If you do just normal searches, that, you know, getting answers to stuff is fairly easy. Okay. So so we can do all the normal stuff. Let's try, instead of just getting everything, we want to filter. So we want just a subset of everything. So instead of student.objects.get, we can do student.objects.all. We can do student.objects.filter. And then we're going to pass it again some kind of limiting thing. So we can do name. So let's look at the model. So name. And the way this works, again, please refer to the documentation, but you can give it like a column name, so name, and then a double underscore. Oops. So name and then double underscore, and then some kind of like a field. Let me see. The field lookups. Yeah, field lookups. So there are a whole bunch of these lookups, and you can think of these as being basically like a where clause. So we want to filter student objects where name starts with, for example, is W. So you get all of the students whose name starts with W. So the syntax here is a little weird maybe, but you can think of this as like a where clause with Django. So where the name, so the syntax here is, this is the column name. So that's this right here, where name double underscore, and then there are a whole bunch of these, like starts with, case insensitive, exact match, contains, starts with, ends with. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you can use. And then you can also chain these together. So you can, for example, starts, so I can filter, so student objects.filter, so I get everyone whose name starts with a W, and then I can also do another filter, filter email, and let's also do start with equals, I'll do I starts with, I believe that's a thing, case insensitive. And I get no results. So let's maybe try a different value. There we go. We get one. But notice that we're in the query set, which, you know, we have one result in this query set, but it only shows the kind of representation that we tell it to. So we can actually, what if we want to see the email and maybe the ID and everything else? So we can actually, again, this is not something, you'll have to look through the documentation. So a lot of what you're going to be doing today in the next couple of days is looking through documentation. I don't know why this, okay, so dot values. And this is going to give you a dictionary of everything. So the ID, the name, and then the email. You can see that the email does start with a lowercase a. So you can also do things like order by. Let's get this query right here. So we have a whole bunch of students and we can order by. And then let's see, we can pass in a field name. So let's order by email. Oops. It's order underscore. And this order should probably be different. So yeah. So the order is different here. So again, a lot of this is just going to be kind of looking through the documentation. How do you know, and let's say I have this, but I only want the first two results. So I order it by email and I only want maybe the first email or something like that. You can do, you can use Python bracket notation here. So you do something like that. And I only get the first student. So it's kind of like doing limit 1 or something like that. And you could set that to be whatever you want. So 3, I get the first 3 results. Okay, and then I just want to, one more quick thing with the queries. So there's something called basically like a queue. You can have more complex queries. You can kind of basically create like a function that's like a query and then you just combine them together. Yeah, so you can do okay, so let me just say filtering, we can actually pass it another parameter, which could be email starts with, and we'll do lowercase a since that one worked. And we're going to get that same result. So implicitly, this filter is going to be like, it's going to do an and. So it's going to do name starts with W and email starts with A. So if you want to do more complex things, like for example, doing an or, then you can use, I have to import. So from import, what was it? From Django.db. I think that's where it is. No, it is not. Let me check here. Yeah, this is Q objects. Django.db.models. Put Q. All right. And now I'm going to take this and both these parameters, I'm going to make them Q objects, which basically like, you know, little subqueries basically. Okay, and I'm going to make this or. And I get a lot more results because it's instead of whatever 3 results we were getting, or actually 1 result when it was and the or, we get a whole bunch of results. And if we wanted to see all of the values there, we could do dot values. like this. We can get everything. So the entire thing will show up by default. We can also restrict that. So let's just say we want to get the email. You can pass it email. We only see the emails. So again, for today, and basically for this week, it's largely going to be, so I mean, we know how SQL works basically. So it's going to be looking through the documentation and figuring out how to make queries using the Django ORM. So are there any questions about that? So the documentation is your friend. You'll be doing lots of internet searches today. Okay, so the challenge here, Django queries. I will say just as a heads up, so this tells you you're going to create a virtual environment, and then you're going to install. I don't know that we've actually done this before, but this is kind of like doing npm install, where it will look at your package.json and install everything that you have for the project. Pip, you can do something similar. So the requirements.txt, this is going to include everything that you need to run the project. Django, Scicop G2, and so on. So install all of the requirements once you have your virtual environment created and activated. And then you'll go in here, and it's basically going to be one of those things where you'll look at the tests, and then you'll need to reverse engineer what you do. So you have the tests here, tells you what should happen. And then you have this file here. So this is not really like modeled. This is, don't think of this as being like a real Django app. This is just getting you familiar with the ORM.